in order to relate things we've learned about motor representation back to the philosophy of action, it is useful to return to what we're calling the problem of action. That is the question, what distinguishes your actions from things that merely happen to you? This is our anchor because it's been a focus for a great deal of philosophy of action, so it provides us with a clear connection. And also because, to some extent, although perhaps less and less as we go through the course, it seems like any framework for understanding action that will allow us to evaluate the meaning of experiments and to interpret observations will, among perhaps many other things, have to solve this problem, or so it might seem. So the problem of action is a good starting point, and the standard solution is something even today quite widely held among philosophers of action. Put crudely, the idea is that actions are those events which stand in an appropriate causal relation to an intention. Now consider an alternative to the standard solution. It's actually just like the standard solution, but it switches out intention for motor representation. So this alternative solution says actions are those events which stand in an appropriate causal relation to motor representation. What recommends the alternative solution? Well, first of all, we know that any bodily action will indeed have to involve motor representation. So we have a kind of guarantee here that the alternative solution will pick out actions. So that seems like a clear recommendation, and at the very least we can be as secure as we can that they involve intentions, perhaps even more. Secondly, we saw a little bit earlier in this section that there is a strong overlap in the role of intention and motor representation insofar as both involve specifying outcomes, coordinating actions, and coordinating them in such a way that normally, or at least if things go well, they make it more likely that those outcomes occur, and in this way they ground the directedness of actions. Given this overlap in the roles of intention and motor representation, it seems that the alternative solution is at least as good as the standard solution as far as that goes. So it's very hard, I suggest to you, to find a good reason for preferring the standard solution to the alternative solution. And indeed, I think that if you look at the published work in philosophy of action, you won't find any explicit considerations which would say the alternative solution is somehow worse than the standard solution. So this leads me to an objection. The objection to the standard solution as a solution to the problem of action is that the alternative solution, invoking motor representations, yields a solution to the problem of action that is no worse, right? So if I've got something which I'm claiming is the unique solution to the problem of action, and then something else comes along that isn't obviously worse, I can no longer maintain that. So the objection. Now, whenever we have an objection, it's very important, of course, to consider responses to the objection. But before I do that, I would like, first of all, to consider how this objection relates to an earlier objection that we saw, one which involves habitual processes. So this earlier objection says that the standard solution is wrong because some actions run counter to any of an agent's intentions, because those actions are dominated by habitual processes. So you might remember this objection from earlier. So now we've come to two objections to the standard solution. And if you've read the notes, you'll know that in your work, I'm encouraging you to focus on just one of these objections, either the first one or the second one. But I do think it's worthwhile to compare and contrast because there is a sense in which the two objections are complementary. Let me explain. This first objection, as we saw, is not consistent with the claim that all actions are appropriately related to intentions. If the first objection succeeds, then there are actions which are not appropriately related to an agent's intentions. Either the agent doesn't have intentions, or they do have intentions, but the action runs counter to all of those intentions. By contrast, the second objection that we're considering is consistent with the claim that all actions are appropriately related to intentions. So as far as this second objection goes, we are not denying that where you have an action, that you have an event which is appropriately related to an intention. That's absolutely consistent with this objection. The objection is merely to the claim that provides you with a unique solution to the standard, a unique solution to this problem of action. Right? That's what the objection tells us. The objection says, look, either you've got to say, look, the standard solution and the alternative solution are two equally good answers to the problem, and so you've got to accept that there are multiple ways of solving the problem of action. Or you've got to say that neither of them are any good, and we need some alternative, either a combination of the standard and alternative, or more likely some entirely different approach to solving the problem of action. But in any case, saying that is absolutely neutral on the question of whether actions are events which stand in appropriate relation to an intention. Now that's important for our purposes because it means that the two objections are complementary in that the kind of responses to one of them will not necessarily be good responses to another. So if we want to hold on to the standard solution to the problem of action, we need responses to both objections, and very likely, because the objections are quite different, those responses will be different too. So we have seen now two objections to the standard solution to the problem of action. I do not think that these are the only possible objections. As we saw earlier, various philosophers have thought about habitual processes, perhaps not with terribly great accuracy or deference to the literature on animal learning and other cases where habitual processes are important. For some reason, philosophers really love to study William James from the previous millennium, but are kind of somehow a bit reluctant to, some of them, to look at the latest research there. We've also seen that there's an objection from motor processes, but again, this might not be the only objection that you can come up with. There may be other objections to the standard solution that we could derive from reflection on discoveries about motor processes. So what I'd encourage you to do is to treat these two objections as samples. These are the kind of ways in which discoveries in the behavioural sciences might challenge broadly philosophical assumptions about the nature of action in a way that is constructive, in the sense that it requires coming up with some alternative framework and some alternative models. We haven't yet said anything that would allow us just to eliminate the problem of action altogether. It looks like it still needs a solution. So the message so far is that discoveries in the behavioural sciences do matter for the philosophy of action, and they matter in the most direct way that you can imagine. They provide the basis for apparently coherent, well-motivated objections to philosophical claims. Right. Very good. What we still need to do, though, is to consider some responses to objection 2. One should never, absolutely never consider an objection without trying to investigate how people will reply. And I have to apologise to you that because of the time constraints in the lectures, I'm only going to do that in the most superficial way possible. We're just going to look at a couple of interesting lines of response. I very much hope that in the question time following this section, that you might be coming up with alternative ways to respond to these objections. And certainly if you're writing about any objection, these or any other objections, we need to have a kind of deep probe into possible responses to it. So how might we respond to the first objection? Well, the second objection, the objection that the alternative solution involving motor processes is no worse than the standard solution involving intentions. Well, the first response is just to accept the objection, right? And of course here there are lots of ways of then carrying on. So we might say the standard solution is not the only solution. There are multiple solutions, and that will have some consequences in our philosophy of action, but it won't actually have terribly dramatic consequences as long as we can hold on to the correctness of the standard solution. So this is an objection which causes, if you like, minimal damage, and so this response might be quite a reasonable response to it. Alternatively, we could respond by saying the standard solution is not just not the only solution, it's also not a correct solution, and come up with some alternative. And I think that the objection might motivate us in doing that. A different line of response would be to try to reject the objection. Let's try to reject the objection. Now, what we need to do in order to reject the objection is to identify considerations which favour the standard solution mentioning intention over the alternative solution, which mentions motor representation. So this is very open-ended here. We need any old considerations, any decent consideration that works here will provide us with a good response to that objection, potentially. A natural thing to reach for, I think, here is the consideration that actions are done for reasons. And that's something you can see, for example, in Donald Davidson, where we've used Davidson as a focus rather than other philosophers like Harry Frankfurt that we might have used, or Brand, or whoever it might be. We've used Davidson. And Davidson's very clear right from the start, right from that 1967 paper, Actions, Reasons and Causes, that actions are things which are done for reasons. So you might think somehow there is somehow this constraint on what we want, which is that actions are done for reasons. And appealing to intention somehow gets us an acknowledgement that actions are things are done for reasons, in a way that appealing to motor representation doesn't. Just here in developing that response, we face two challenges. One challenge is that actually, this sort of done for reasons thing, if we leave that open, it looks like the motor representations are just as closely related to reasons as are the intentions. After all, the way that you shape your hand as it approaches an object, there are reasons which explain why your hand moves in that way. The motor system attempts to provide a certain kind of optimality in action, and often enough comes close to that. So it would be a mistake to think that there's nothing at all to say about the reasons why your body moves in the way that it does. The actions which are involved in grasping, lifting, transporting, placing and so on, those are just as much to be explained by invoking reasons as things like going on holiday or voting in an election. So one problem here is that we're going to have to say something a bit more about done for reasons. We might have to say something like, it's not just that there are reasons which explain why the action occurred, which make the action seem in some or another way optimal relative to a set of background considerations or values. It's also that, let's say, the reasons are considerations which from the agent's own perspective somehow favour the action. So we might go down that kind of route. The problem here is that the more we push on this, the more we try to elaborate the notion of being done for a reason and make it something which involves more of the agent's perspective, the less plausible it is that this will be a feature of absolutely every action that there is. It will gradually start to seem like a rather special case. So it's very difficult, I think, to identify a consideration that does favour the standard solution over the alternative solution. And I think that's going to require quite a bit of work. It seems to me that there may well be something to say about reasons that will be helpful here, but it's going to be quite difficult to work out what that is. And I would quite like to make more progress there. The second obstacle is related to the first. So the first obstacle is, look, we need to kind of spell out this notion of done for reasons in a way that, on the one hand, doesn't apply where we're just thinking about motor representation, links back specifically to intention, but on the other hand, doesn't very much narrow down the range of things that we're talking about so that it manifestly doesn't include actions. The second problem is that we mustn't change the subject here. So the standard solution is supposed to be the answer to the problem of action, and that's a specific question about what distinguishes actions from things that merely happen to agents. It won't do to change the question. It won't do to defend the standard solution by covertly or explicitly changing the question. After all, it's hardly surprising, I think it's even trivial, that the standard solution is the answer to some question or other. There will be a way of setting things up so that the standard solution is an answer, but that's not what we're evaluating. We're evaluating the standard solution as an answer to the problem of action, and we have to respect that. Okay, good. So we have an objection and we have some preliminary attempt to think about how responses might be constructed. If you want to defend the objection and use it to attack the standard solution as a unique solution to the problem of action, you need to consider these responses in great depth. If, on the other hand, you think that you have a good response to the objection, then of course you have to take the opposite side and think, well, what do proponents of that objection think? What are they demanding and how might I satisfy them, so that we can hopefully make here a further discovery. So we've been thinking about this objection, which says that there is an alternative to the standard solution involving intention rather than motor representation, and the alternative solution is no worse than the standard solution. On the face of it, that seems like a good objection, one that motivates rethinking the standard solution to the problem of action.